That's it.
We can see it now, can we?
That's it. I can see it fine.
Jolly good. Well, very good evening to everybody. And thank you for having me along to talk to you this evening about broadcasting in Britain, or at least the birth of it. Just a bit about me, as some of you do know me, some of you don't. Mike Whiskey Zero, November Whiskey Mike. November Whiskey Mike is for not a Welshman, or North Walesman, but definitely not a Welshman. Originally from Worcestershire, but for 10 years lived in Shropshire, and for about 5 years I was a member of TDARS. And I'm sure Mr. UFE there would be able to tell you some stories about pile cream and a few other things without going into that. So, interest obviously just generally amateur radio. I like to mess around with the old amplitude modulation, bit of HF. Used to enjoy doing VHF contesting with TDARS, obviously. We were just talking about it field day. So apart from that, I'm a member of the Dragon Amateur Radio Club, and they're based on Anglesey, in the village with the longest place name in the UK. No, I'm English, don't ask me to say it. We all call it, the locals call it Llanfair Pwllgwyl. They don't say any more than that because it just goes on forever. And I also have a role with the RSGB, working with the special interest groups, so national affiliated societies and special interest groups, from RAPARs to the microwave groups to Summits on the Air, QRP Club, etc. There's dozens of them. So let's do. Could someone just give Graham? Can you give me a thumbs up? Can you hear me? Okay. Brilliant. Okay, we'll try not to send you to sleep. So we're looking at the birth of broadcasting, or as we could say, how a ragtag collection of equipment, a newspaper magnate, an Australian singer, an ex-Royal Flying Corps captain, and dozens of radio amateurs helped to create the birth of broadcasting in the UK, well, in Britain. I've just put a few pictures up there, which had a pivotal role in the first advertised broadcast. Now, someone there might be able to guess what the pivotal role is. Mr. UFE, unmute your mic a minute. Brilliant. What have we got in front of you there, Simon, apart from the obvious of a telephone?
Well, we've got some cigars. The hat and coat stand, I'm not quite sure about that one, Si, but and the other one, some sort of white tape?
Almost. We've got the telephone, we've got the coat stand or whatever, we've also got knicker elastic, and we're not interested in cigars, we're interested in the box. Now, if you know what the role they played in the very first broadcast, do you know the role they played there, Simon?
No, go on.
No, that's why I'm not telling you yet. I'll mute you up, but well done, thank you.
Back to me.
Okay, but they all played this role in the very first broadcast, which we'll come to later. So it's like teaching you how to suck eggs, but if you passed your foundation license, you know about AM radio transmissions, from the audio stage, the modulator, the frequency generator, be it a VFO or a fixed frequency, and then a radio frequency amplifier to amplify the signal. So we're mixing the audio to the RF frequency, and we're altering the amplitude, the depth of the wave of the transmission, as opposed to the frequency, which the oldest form of voice communication is AM. So obviously the earliest transmissions, broadcasts, were in AM mode. So that's just there, just out of the way, quick, because I've also done this talk a couple of times to completely non-radio amateurs, so it's always worth throwing that in to try and picture it. I have notes just to remind me where I am. And they're in the wrong order. That's always good, isn't it? Okay, but before we go into Britain, here we are, I found it. We need to just sort of maybe have a look across the Atlantic at this chap, Reginald Fessenden, Canadian by birth, became an American citizen in 1902, and with some finances from Pittsburgh, founded the National Electric Signaling Company. And it was his idea to sort of rival the efforts of Marconi at the time in being able to have telegraph traffic across the Atlantic by wireless. And he was thinking about voice transmissions also in the future. So his company was going along. And he claims to have had the world's first broadcast, I put question mark, from Brant Rock, Massachusetts, part of the National Electric Signaling Company's transatlantic setup to try and rival the Glace Bay and Poldhu and all of the other elements, finally Wynvour and Tywin. TDARS know all about Tywin, the seaside of that Marconi setup. Wasn't particularly successful, and it was struggling to compete with Marconi in any sense, even in these early days. But the equipment was there. And Fessenden thought, well, we could try experimenting with voice. On the 24th of December, so New Year's Eve, 1906, Fessenden claimed the world's first broadcast. And by all accounts, it was received as far away as Norfolk, Virginia. So a fair distance. However, this whole story wasn't revealed in press or any form until the mid-1930s. So quite some time after this alleged broadcast. So there is still some debate about whether it actually happened, or if it did happen, how successful was it? But there's Mr. Fessenden sat at the position where he allegedly transmitted from. And what did the broadcast consist of? Well, like any good modern broadcast, it consisted of records or a phonograph, a recording on a phonograph of Handel's Largo aria. He read verses from the Gospel according to Luke, so the Holy Bible was there. I mean, it was Christmas after all. And being ever talented, we can see his violin there. He played a violin solo. And then apparently he rounded off by wishing everyone a Merry Christmas. So this is the first evidence, or the first alleged broadcast in the world. And I like to think he probably did do it. But the Americans like to be first, so who knows? But it's just strange that it wasn't advertised, or it wasn't recorded or mentioned until the mid-30s. That's why I have a little bit of doubt. And I've been researching and I'm struggling to find any more, but here you are. But that was happening over there. In Europe in the early 1900s, in Holland, in Paris, there was a few other places that were experimenting, and there were early broadcasts, but primarily I'm focusing on Great Britain. But before we can get to the early broadcasts, we need to look at the Marconi Company. So in 1898, so just before Fessenden, a few years before, Marconi founded the Wireless Telegraph Company. So in 1898, it was just over 2 years old, and he'd come across the UK, where the post office had shown some interest in wireless communication with telegraph. The chief engineer from the post office, William Priest, who's from Carnarvon, just 7 miles from me down here. So the Welsh like to claim wireless as their invention because they helped nurture it. In spite of that, by 1898, the company it's made no money, despite many demonstrations of the apparatus to, the Royal Navy, the Army, and some of the private concerns. But Marconi had made 0 sales, and he's teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. So when people are teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, normally they just go to the bank and ask for help or even give up on something. Marconi managed to get some money together from a couple of friends who were still faithful to him. And he took a lease out on the old silk works in Chelmsford in Essex. And the picture you can see in front of you is that building, the old silk works, which became Marconi's Hall Street Works, which ran for about 14 years there. And it was the first wireless factory in the world, not just the UK, the world. That was the very first. And in 1899, in the January of 1899, they opened for business. But they had no business with wireless work because no one was interested at this point. So they ended up doing subcontract work for the land telegraph systems, so maybe for the post office for their telegraph systems across the United Kingdom, and even perhaps some work for some equipment that would have gone on transatlantic cables. So not a very auspicious start for a wireless company. However, as we all know the basic Marconi story, it was only a few short years and the whole situation improved for him and this company. But I'm still going a bit further. We're looking at some notable events now where equipment manufactured at Hall Street was used for some quite interesting conflicts. Graham, if you unmute yourself.
Sir Baden-Powell.
You recognise the person. Who was it?
Yeah, Sir Baden-Powell.
Yeah, thank you. So Robert Baden-Powell, and Stevenson Smythe Baden-Powell, Lord of Gilwell, eventually, founded the Boy Scouts. Except before he founded the Boy Scouts, he was also a well-known military gentleman and became a war hero, very much like Churchill and Montgomery and all of those in the Second World War. He was a hero of his age. He fought in South Africa, and the war between Britain, well, the United Kingdom, and the self-governing Afrikaner, the Boer colonies in the south of the country. The South African Republic of Transvaal and the Orange Free State, to be precise. At the outbreak of this war, Britain ruled the South African colonies of the Cape of Natal, so there was a little bit of regional tension between these powers. And Baden-Powell was in a place called Mafeking, which was laid siege to by the Boer for quite some months. And he used young people as scouts to send messages to and from the military around the town or out to try and get help. He used them to set up mock defences, to confuse the enemy. And generally, all the ideas for where Boy Scouts and what they could do came from this sort of time. But why am I talking about that? In the camps and in that war, the British were using Marconi transmitters and receivers, spark transmitters, so no continuous wave, just at the high voltage across the two terminals to make the spark. So it'd be like a crackling, buzzing noise in the receiver, not a nice tone you'd hear with a Morse code today. It worked quite well. They managed to get signals to and from. Ironically, Marconi had also supplied equipment, like an arms dealer would do today, to the other side. So the Boer of the Afrikaans also had some more limited but use of his equipment. But it proved very useful. And of course, that message starts getting out there that this equipment does have a use. So by early 1900s, Marconi's equipment is being sold and being used in its most basic form, but it's all just Morse code. And in a similar vein, the Chinese Boxer Rebellion, 1900. Anyone who doesn't know that one, and I'll be truthful, I didn't before. I'm not a historian. The Boxers were a secret Chinese organization called the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists. And there was a bit of a Japanese influence on them. And these rebels were referred to as boxers, mainly because they believed in their cult that by using certain physical exercises, they could build up their strength, and just by mind power and their strength alone, they could deflect the bullets of the opposition and not be killed. We know that didn't particularly work. But they laid siege to Beijing, then Peking, China's capital, which is where the Western powers have their sort of financial hub, the Americans, the British, amongst others. So there was an international force brought together to sort them out, to subdue the uprising. And by the end of by 1901, it had been subdued, and China had to pay back $330 million in reparations to the British and the Americans. $330 million is a lot of money now. In 1900, that was one heck of a lot of money. However, why am I telling you all this? It's another history lesson, but once again, Marconi's equipment was used as basic spark transmitters by both sides. So this chap Marconi, he knows his equipment has a use. He also knows how to sell things, or his team do. He's very good at selling what he's built. So now we move on. More notable events and use of equipment. 8th of May 1901. Where are we? The Royal Navy ordered its first 32 wireless sets. It's 108. So these were just, again, spark gap transmitters. There is HMS Majestic, built in 1885. It's what's called a Majestic class. Back when we had a pretty large navy, and to say the Royal Navy was starting to experiment. We all know the famous 12th of December 19, respecting amateur wouldn't know, that that was the time when Marconi bridges the Atlantic for the first time, from Poldhu in Cornwall to St John's, Newfoundland. That picture there is actually Marconi in Newfoundland with the equipment, or part of the equipment. Looks like something I've thrown together with bits of wire cobbled together. But at the specified hour, he was listening out with his associate there for a letter S, just the letter S. And out of the ether at that prearranged time, the letter S was heard. The 3 dots over and over again. He heard it, he bridged the Atlantic. Or did he? There's still some debate about whether the equipment was powerful enough, or if not powerful enough, the receiving equipment was accurate and sensitive enough to receive it. Did he receive the S? 3 dots? Or was it noise and static, the QRN, the natural noise? So did he a little white lie? At the moment on Marconi's future as business, the enterprise of the wireless works, it was secure, and things started to grow quite rapidly. So a couple of notable events. And the unsinkable ship, like a collision with an iceberg, a glancing collision with an iceberg. It hit late on the 14th, and by the 15th, early hours, it was gone. And we all know the story, lack of lifeboats and whatever. But from the wireless room, spark gap transmitter goes in. Until they ran out of, well, the electric went as the ship began to sink. And it summoned the Carpathia. 730 souls were saved from the waters, off the boat, off the ships, the little rowing boats, and were saved. We know over 1,000 lost their lives, tragically. But without wireless, you could pretty much argue that none of them would have been saved because they'd have died of exposure in the elements, or whatever, waiting for someone who wouldn't necessarily know their exact position. So that's one. Marconi was hailed as a national hero here and in the US, just basically a hero, because his equipment, though it didn't save everybody in the tragedy, it saved an awful lot of lives. And a few years later, 3 years later, May 1915, the Royal Mail ship Lusitania torpedoed by a German U-boat. 760 lives were saved on that occasion because of the invention of wireless summoning help. Let's take a quick drink. I'd like to say it was BSI, but it's tea. And it's definitely not Jack Daniels or any other Jack. So this is the wireless room, or at least a mock-up of the wireless room of the Titanic. Hang on. I think someone's offering me a cup of tea. That's Beth, just taking my mug for a cup of tea. So this is the wireless room of the Titanic, and we can, you can't really see in this picture, but there is the coil for the frequency setting. You've got the spark gap. On the wall, you've got something called a Branly coherer, a magneto coherer, and various other bits and pieces. The main generators for the electric were in the neighbouring room. And the other picture there is of a chap called John George Phillips, known as Jack Phillips, who died on the Titanic at the age of 25. He was one of those that was on the Morse key that night, summoning help. And if you can see the cap badge, it's not a white Starline cap, it's a Marconi cap. Because unless you were employed by the military, anyone else outside of the military, so commercial concerns, shipping, whatever else, that wanted to use Marconi equipment, also had to pay Marconi for the staff to man the equipment. So not only did he have the monopoly on the equipment, but also he charged them quite a bit of money to put staff in as well. So they worked to his rules on their vessels. However, the positive is that they were paid very, very well. But unfortunately, that didn't save poor old Jack's life. Anyway, onward from the Titanic. End of an era. And the Hall Street factory closes down in 1912. Haven't written the date down exactly. Closes a production facility because they'd outgrown it. So it did serve a use in the First World War for some years. It was used as a oh wait, my wife there blowing my ear. It was used as a Y station, a listening post. We all know about the secret listeners in the Second World War, mostly amateurs in their own homes, listening for the enemy transmissions and then handing them on to Bletchley Park. When the First World War, Y stations did a very similar thing. The traffic, the signals, etc., some in code, and then they were taken by, not Royal Mail, by some quick dispatch rider to room 40 in this building you see in front of you. It's not Hall Street, it's far too grand. It's the Admiralty in London, and to the room 40 and the code breakers there. So it stopped as a facility of production, but it did last a few more years helping the war effort. Okay, Hall Street's gone. Where have they moved to? Excuse me. Cheers, gents and ladies. Hall Street. Right, the world's purpose-built wireless factory. And this was a monster of a place. New Street Works. 12. There we are. It was the world's first purpose-built factory for wireless and was a successful base for the Marconi company for 100 years. What I found really interesting was that from the conception, the idea of having this new production facility, research, production, development facility, through the design stage and the building of the place, some bits were added on, but the very basics of the place took just 17 weeks to complete. Can you imagine that? You wouldn't even get your planning permission in 17 weeks in the UK today. In fact, I wouldn't even know if the architects would get the drawings that quickly. But 17 weeks and they built this, they designed, got permission, built the place. And then all the staff were paid for an extra for a weekend. And in 48 hours, they transferred the whole of their production, 100% everything, and the office equipment to the new buildings, which I think is quite a staggering achievement in itself. So here we are, Hall Street Works, a slightly different angle. You can see by 1919, they've put in some quite hefty masts for some experimental work. They were 450 feet. You can see the metric on there, 140. They were like a tubular steel construction. And at that point, some kind of Marconi T, sort of a T-type Marconi T that they were using, which Radio 4 Longwave at Droitwich is still using a Marconi T aerial. And the whole facility had 70,000 feet of square feet of construction and research space, so it was quite an impressive building. And so it was obvious that in those few short years from 1898 that Marconi had really come somewhere. I mean, you're talking, what, 21 years? So we're moving closer to now to talking about voice work. So in the Great War, the First World War, the Royal Flying Corps, the quite recent event of the Royal Flying Corps, was flying up, and as well as taking pot shots at the opposition, with early on with the pistols out from the cockpit and slightly later with machine guns, once they'd figured out how to do it without knocking the propellers off, they were sent quite often to go and look at enemy positions and to report back. And this was originally done in the very early days with spark transmitters. Now you can imagine you're in a Sopwith Camel or some other little biplane, mostly made of wood and canvas. And as you're flying along, they had to wear the goggles and they were breathing in the fumes from the engine, and bits of oil used to splash back on them. And to tap it all off, they're flying over enemy territory and looking over their lines. That's tough enough as it is. But then they're expected to report back and let the authorities, the British, know what they can see. So they need to send Morse code. They're flying this thing, they're looking out for the enemy, they're looking down below to see what's going on. And then they've got a Morse key fastened to their leg. The transmitter sat on their lap. And the battery, or the what do they call them, those nice glass cells they used to use, can't think of the word now, was sat beneath their feet. So
Simon,
yeah.
Leclanche cell. A Leclanche cell.
Leclanche cell or condenser, that'll do. Thank you very much. Thanks, Si. And a lot of my grandfather used to talk about taking those down to a local shop to get them recharged for their early wireless sets. Anyhow, it's got this all going on. So you imagine sending spark transmissions back while trying to fly the thing single-handedly while looking out for the enemy that hopefully you don't get shot down by them. Not particularly convenient. So the Marconi company was asked to look at producing a transmitter and receiver that could receive voice communication over a short area. And this is where a chap called Captain Henry Joseph Round came in. He'd been Marconi's personal assistant from 1902. In fact, he was in the Atlantic experiments and was over in North America with him, with Marconi, when he received that letter S on that fateful day. He was charged with a few others with developing vacuum tubes, valves as we would call them. And the valves you see here, as fragile as they look, which they were very fragile, where the top one is something called a Q valve, and the one below, I think, is the V24. And the information on them is very scant and very, very not great. But these two valves gave, I can see Simon stroking a pussycat on his shoulder. Sorry, Si. It's bizarre, this online talking. Anyway, these are the valves that went into the very first AM transmitter receivers in the cockpit. And all of a sudden, you didn't need to have it sat on your lap. They managed to fit it into the aircraft a lot smaller, a lot more convenient, not perfect, but they could get the message back to base. Dogs are in there. So you can see below a bunch of the Royal Flying Corps listening and practicing their CW and how the the wireless equipment returns. And this proved pretty effective. But fortunately, the war did eventually end, as we know. But so we can just see, just a reminder, we all know how valve technology works. I'm not going to go through it. We know they pretty much have lethal voltages going across them. But until we sort of came along with some of the more useful things like transistors, this is the way to go. And in fact, amateur equipment still has valves in it, especially amplifiers, and even some broadcast equipment, for instance. Droitwich, the long-wave transmitter still works on valves. We'll move on. 1918, 1920, you're back to peacetime activity. Marconi goes back to building commercial equipment. And, we're looking now at what the company can go, can develop from here on in. But coming out of the forces, there were many, soldiers, RAF men, that had learned how to use this Marconi equipment. Some of those that had been quite useful with it were snatched up by Marconi. Company took them on. They might have gone for White Star Line or one of the other shipping companies, or the military would have kept them on. But those that retired from the military, also an awful lot became radio amateurs and started to build their own receivers, and once the GPO gave permission, transmitters. But apart from talking to each other, other amateurs, and listening to commercial traffic, Morse code signals being sent out to White Star Line in the Atlantic, plotting positions or sending the news of the day, or aircraft coming into land and just giving their position, etc. There was pretty much very little to listen to. And that situation carried on for a little while. I've just put up the old cat's whisker crystal set, effectively, which a lot of people were using at that point, quite often because valves are very expensive to buy and not very reliable. So what else could they listen to? From the early 20s, there were occasional experimental broadcasts from Paris, the Netherlands, and if propagation allowed, there were some signals from the USA received. So you can see that things are starting to happen. So most people use a cat's whisker as a receiver, and the cat's whisker itself was effectively working like a diode in a crystal set. So what is a cat's whisker? Well, you've got a crystal of galena, a natural material made primarily of lead. Well, if you didn't have one, most boys in those days could get hold of the old lead soldiers. So they'd melt down 2 lead soldiers, 3 soldiers, and with a few flowers of sulfur, lead sulfite, they could create an artificial crystal. So you throw up your long antenna down the garden, you have this very fine coiled spring you can see, and with a little tuned circuit with a coupler, loose coupling or whatever, good ground and some headphones, you could tickle the crystal until you found a spot where you'd receive some noise or a signal, and away you go, hey presto. Very, very basic. And the better the detection, the louder the signal in the ears. There we are. So people are listening, but there's not much to listen to. And if they're communicating, they could only communicate with the few amateurs that were around at the time. So another nice little crystal set down there, and the bottom right in the photo. And you can see the cat's whisker. And just again, another drawing. Now, Marconi was also at this point producing the headphones, amongst other companies, of course. They were quite expensive. And they were 25 shillings, or thereabouts on average, which is what, £1.25 today, but of course we're talking 100 years ago. People didn't earn a fat lot. And, I can't see you, KV, but I'm assuming he's there. Martin, can you unmute yourself a second? Is he there?
Hello.
Martin, now, if you were listening to a crystal set with a set of headphones like that, and you wanted to make it louder for the family to hear, what could you do?
You can put a horn on the end, like the HMV horn, where they have a dog listening.
Yeah.
Can't think of much else.
Well, that would do. My grandfather always used to say that they used to put them in a big pudding bowl. They used to make the mix for making a cake.
Yeah.
A big bowl to do the same. Thank you, Martin. Just checking people awake. That's great. So put them in the bowl, put them a horn on the end, and away you go. So they're selling this equipment, bits and pieces. There isn't a lot to listen to. Now we're going back to that nice New Street Works. Captain Ditcham. I mentioned, was it Ditcham or Round? Just lost my way. There was Captain Round, wasn't there? I mentioned in the army, in the Royal Flying Corps, and a chap called Ditcham, Mr. Ditcham, who you can see seated there next door to a transmitter. Notice they've put a white emulsion almost at the take out the background, but bring the transmitter into sharp focus. In 1920, the post office, the GPO, the General Post Office, today it would be Ofcom, of course. When I first started being interested in radio, it was the DTI, Department of Trade and Industry, were involved and all of that. Anyway, 1920, they issued a license to the Marconi Company at Chelmsford to establish an experimental station for experiments with CW, Morse code, and voice transmissions. And it was given the call sign MZX, and they used to call it Marconi Zulu X-ray. And it went through various configurations starting at about 4 kilowatts, but ended up as a 15 kilowatt transmitter on roughly 2,800 meters. So if you think about top band 160, 1.8 megs is 160 meters. To have a resonant antenna, it's going to be awfully big. So we know that even at the Chelmsford factory there, the New Street Works, with those huge 140 meter, were they, masts, that the antenna that was slung from there was not going to be very efficient. However, that's what they had. So they built this transmitter, various transmitters, and Ditcham and Round started some irregular test transmissions. They were never publicised, and they were all very similar. They'd go something like this. This is MZX calling, Marconi Zulu X-ray calling. This is the Marconi valve transmitter in Chelmsford, England, testing on a wavelength of 2,750 meters. How are our signals coming in today? Can you hear us clearly? And this is the exciting bit. I shall now recite a list of times and stations from the Bradshaw's timetable. What have I done? Go back. The Bradshaw's timetable. If anyone's ever seen that Michael Portillo chap on TV with his great railway journeys, Martin nodding. Bradshaw was originally a Victorian publication of all the British timetables, and it carried on into the 1900s. So you'd be listening to stations from Bromsgrove to Birmingham, or from Telford didn't exist then, did it? But Shrewsbury to Cardiff or something, and I'd give you the times, and it'd be a very tedious thing to listen to. But this was one of the first broadcasts we had in the UK. However, by the 15th of January, so only a couple of weeks into this license, Ditcham, who sat there, decided to try something different. He transmitted news, he read news from the newspaper, so gave the world's first news bulletin, or at least the UK's first news bulletin. And then he decided to become a DJ, a disc jockey, as it were now, in modern parlance. He played gramophone records, played on a wind-up gramophone, with its horn coming out, holding what is effectively the microphone of a telephone receiver to the horn of the gramophone. It was hardly high-fidelity transmission. I said that it was a 15 kilowatt input to the transmitter. I put output on their slide on 2,800 meters. So that was the first real broadcast of any interest in what you'd think of as a modern day broadcast in the UK, like a Radio 2, Radio 4 still does it. They have news, they have drama, or they have music, not Radio 4 with music, but you could recognise it today as being a radio broadcast that we would recognise today. So from 23rd of February to the 6th of March, MZX had a slight variation on their licence. They were allowed to broadcast twice a day for 30 minutes a time, at 11 a.m. and at 8 p.m. on the same frequency, the same transmitter. And for the first few transmissions, we had 15 minutes of news read by Mr. Ditcham, and then 15 minutes of entertainment, which was usually gramophone records, although they did start to find people in the Marconi works that could play a violin or a harmonica or whatever else, and we started to have live music played this into this little microphone from the telephone. And then we've got Miss Winifred Sayer. She has the privilege of being the first female voice to ever broadcast live on radio anywhere in the world. She was a bit of a soprano. She worked in an office for a company a couple of hundred yards down the New Street Road in Chelmsford. For a recording company, they had sheet music. They did some early gramophone records. I can't remember the name of it now. And she did 3 15-minute performances and was paid 5 shillings for each performance, which I think is 25 pence now. So all those who thought that the first broadcast by a woman was another certain very famous lady who I'll come on to, it wasn't. It was actually Miss Winifred Sayer. And, she was actually, she was in the room with the engineers, with the transmitter. It wasn't the most salubrious of surroundings. It was dusty. There was lots of equipment lying around. There was hard concrete floors. She's singing into this old telephone receiver. You've got the hum of the generators in the room next door, and apparently they were very difficult to listen to. It wasn't the best of transmissions. However, amateurs who found these, and other people who just, radio amateurs and other people that had an interest, their crystal sets, started to listen in. They weren't called listeners, they were listeners in the early days. So there starts to be a bit of talk around the United Kingdom about radio and what Marconi's company are doing. Although the Marconi company, even at this stage, don't think there's any commercial use for it. But this gentleman thought there might be something in it. Alfred Harmsworth, founder of the Daily Mail newspaper. He was quite a savvy chap. He set this newspaper up, and his idea was to keep the stories short, no more than 250 words per story. This was his explicit instructions to his editor. 250 words maximum, so that people wouldn't get bored halfway through. And each publication every day had to have at least one report on a murder, something gruesome that would hold the reader's interest. I mean, it obviously worked because he became a very wealthy and influential man. Now, around about this time, Harmsworth began to recognise that the world was gaining an interest, or Britain was gaining an interest, in wireless and broadcasting. And he came up with this idea of having an advertised broadcast that could be advertised in his paper. People would perhaps listen in, and then he could sell more papers the next day reporting on this amazing scientific and artistic achievement. So, who could sing? Harmsworth knew just the person, and she was an internationally renowned singing superstar. She cut discs. She had 78 discs of her music released. We know there was no charts, but they sold well. The sheet music with the words for her songs sold very well. This was a lady called Dame Nellie Melba. Dame Nellie Melba. Now, anyone knows the word Melba might think of a dessert called a peach Melba, which coincidentally was invented by, I think it was the Ritz. It was certainly one of the top-end hotels in London in honour of Dame Nellie. So she actually had a dessert named after her. Anyway, Dame Nellie was asked, she's an Australian lady, to come and perform at the Marconi Works to sing. Now, initially, she wasn't particularly taken with the idea of going to some grubby factory to sing in a room to virtually no one. She couldn't see why she'd want to do it. She wasn't easily persuaded. However, Lord Harmsworth offered her a nice sweet £1,000. Now, £1,000, as we know, is still a lot of money. If I had £1,000, there might be a new transceiver here. But in those days, 100 years ago, it was worth significantly more. That did the trick. They nearly agreed. Plus, she was 60, and the perceived wisdom was she was starting to lose her voice somewhat. So I suspect that having £1,000 and the publicity, she thought it might just keep her career going and keep her in the spotlight just a little bit longer. So her head was turned and she agreed to come. So here we are, 15th of June 1920. This is when we're going to talk about this historic broadcast. There was no studio for which Ditcham and Captain Round had to go around and sort this out in the factory. They were given, with their team, 2 weeks to prepare. And, checking the equipment, getting a studio ready. What's a studio? What should it have? So some scratching their heads. They searched the factory for a suitable place for Dame Nellie to perform. And they came up with this, in the offices, a rather plush office, which had been used by Marconi on his visits and others. Nice carpet, lovely surroundings. So I thought, okay, we're going to get the piano in there, etc., and the microphone and connect it all up. But we need to test it. This was about 3 days before she was due to appear. The transmitter was switched on one of their regular periods, and we're just going to recite some words and just check it all was all working. There was an awful lot of voltage going to this equipment in the studio, and the studio was quite some distance from the room where the transmitter was based. So there's these wires running through the factory along the floor. There was such a lot of voltage going through that the wire caught fire and stripped the office carpet was ruined. Apparently it was like a fuse. The old wire fuses used to go in the fuse box at home. You used to have to twist the wire in and screw it in. It just went off with a fizzle and just caught fire and went. Fortunately, the transmitter was okay. Carpet was ruined. So they decided that, okay, we want a carpeted room, but we need it closer to the transmitter and we can try and reduce the voltage somewhat, somehow. So they did some work. They found another room. Now, this room was a storage shed, or storage room, just a brick room with lots of junk in it, which is hastily removed. On the orders of Round, they whitewashed the walls. They put some brand new carpet in there, so it looked quite nice. Martin's yawning. They put the piano in. Everything was set up. They needed a microphone. Simon, could you unmute yourself for a minute?
I'm here.
Now, do you remember those items that were on that early slide?
Yes, you've got the knicker elastic, the hat stand, telephone, and I forgot what the other one was. Go on.
It's a cigar box.
Yes, that was it. Yeah.
So if you can see the pictures here, we've got Dame Nellie, when she comes in, is holding the telephone receiver, which is the microphone.
I presume the cigar box is the horn.
It is indeed, yeah. They fashioned it out of the cigar box.
And the hat stand, I presume, is what's holding it all up.
Yeah, hassle coat stand, that's right. And the knicker elastic is suspended. It's suspended on knicker elastic to try and take some vibration out.
Yeah. We do something similar these days with the microphones. We put it in a cat's cradle or something.
Indeed so.
Yeah.
So the world's first broadcast mic was built. Thanks, Si. Coincidentally, this microphone was kept at the Marconi building for quite a few years. It's now in one of the Oxford University collections. I forget which one, but there was a whole collection of Marconi paraphernalia down there. It's really quite fascinating if you get permission. Right. So we've got no professional broadcast mic. This is the best they could do and was obviously going to be better than just the basic telephone one that they were using in the previous experiments. So the great day arrived and Dame Nellie arrived at the factory. The staff were nervously welcoming her. Dame Nellie, welcome, thank you for coming. Lord Harnsworth was there and there were some dignitaries that were going to enjoy a dinner and then listen to the performance by wireless, but in another part of the factory. But Dame Nellie wanted to have a look. They decided to give her a guided tour. She wasn't particularly interested, but they wanted to show off their production facilities, research development, and going around. And one of the showing around the grounds, and they pointed out, one of the officials, dignitaries, pointed out the masts, the huge masts with the aerial outside, and said that that's where your transmission will come from. And Dame Nellie looked quite shocked and She replied in quite a haughty voice, "Young man, if you think I'm going to climb all the way up there and sing, you are very much mistaken." She had the impression that she had to climb up to the top of the tower to sing, not really understanding wireless. But I've heard her voice, it would have carried quite away. The room chosen, as I said, for the studio, this little, fairly small storage room, they were no longer setting light to the carpet, but they introduced her to a studio saying this is where she's going to perform. And she sort of looked around it in a rather sniffy tone and started kicking at the carpet. Lovely, plush, brand new carpet. She didn't like it. It would ruin her sound. It would deaden the echo. She didn't like it at all. She ordered it to be removed a matter of an hour or so before the performance. So it was hastily removed. So Marconi spent quite a bit on carpet this last week or two with the fire and in here. But it was sorted out. And shortly before 7 p.m, the transmitter at Marconi Zulu X-ray MZX was transmitting. And what they had to do in those days, by order of the GPO, was to broadcast in Morse code first, CW. Just, marking the station MZX and maybe Chelmsford or whatever. And then the listeners in with their primitive equipment could seek the signal and tune into them. So the CW was quite a good way of tuning in. And so the listeners were all listening ready for this performance. How many would listen is anybody's guess. You look at Ditcham a couple of slides back, his first performance with the gramophone records, there's about 147 reports sent in from listeners saying they heard his first with gramophone records. So they knew there'd be some kind of audience. So she's all prepared by the microphone. And at 7:10 p.m, I've got to just try this now, see if this works. Hope you can hear this. That's quite enough of that. I'm sorry, in my slides when I do this live, as it were, to an audience, I've actually embedded the YouTube video clip and the audio comes out from speakers and it sounds a lot better than via my mobile I just did. It doesn't work via WebEx that way. Anyway, 7:10 p.m, the allotted moment came and a male voice came on and just said, "This is Dame Nellie Melba from Chelmsford." And she launched into that first song you heard there with piano accompaniment. That was Dame Nellie singing, by the way, if you can call that singing. There's no place like home. It was all going quite well. She got to her first song and she got through that. She's still enthusiastically singing. £1,000, I should think so. And she's into a second song. However, in the neighbouring room or nearby room with the transmitter, you've got some Ditcham and round with the transmitter. But one of the valves in the output stage is going a slightly odd colour, slightly blue colour. And listening in on some equipment, there's a strange warbling sound coming onto the transmission. And then with a slightly loud bang, one of the output transmitter goes, and they're off air. What a calamity when you've got your very first advertised broadcast in the world. So there was a little bit of panic going on in the room, but Dame Nellie Melba was none the wiser. What could they do? The quick-thinking engineers came up with a plan. And they never told Dame Nellie about the truth in all her years. They sent a younger employee up to the studio. He came in and said, "Dame Nellie, the public is listening. They love you, they want more." And she seemed quite impressed by that. I mean, how they would know that they wanted more when they're listening on the wireless? She didn't understand the technology. So she carried on singing. Whilst this was happening, another junior was sent to another storage shed to come with a replacement valve. And by the end of the third number, they were back on air. And people all around the UK and wide further were listening again. She did about 2 more songs, so she's sung about 5 songs now for this £1,000. And she finished off with the national anthem, God Save the King. You know, there was much relief all the way around from the Marconi staff and particularly the engineers. An announcer came back on, said, "You've been listening to Dame Nellie. Good night." And that was it. Transmitter was off. and everyone's receivers went dead. Despite the problems experienced, the broadcast was a hit. And reports, I mean, they had several hundred reports come in, written reports, like we send QSL cards today almost, I suppose. Reports came to the Marconi headquarters there, saying they'd heard the transmission, the broadcast. It was heard all over all parts of the UK. Various transatlantic ships were listening in and actually piping it through to passengers on the vessels. It was heard in Canada. There was even a recorded has been heard in Iran. Now, Iran's a fair distance. In Paris, the reception was that strong that allegedly a 78 revolutions per minute, 78 RPM disc was cut directly from the sound of this radio broadcast. So allegedly, we've never actually seen definite proof. The picture, which I've stolen from somewhere off the internet there, is actually from some of the French dignitaries, or at least the French Transmitting and Receiving Society I had at the time, listening into the actual broadcast itself. So it was a hit. Lord Harmsworth with his newspaper was really impressed. People bought he doubled the circulation of his newspaper on the following day with sales of this newspaper to get the souvenir images to go with the broadcast. So it was a hit, worked out well, and the public wanted more. So following on from that momentous occasion, for a few more months, MZX, the Marconi Zulu X-ray, continued to broadcast with Ditcham and Round primarily on an occasional but now more irregular basis. They were no longer permitted to do the regular broadcasts again. We're back in that storeroom again, no carpet. The same microphone that Dame Nellie used, which coincidentally she autographed when she left. And they put on a few more concerts with amateurs. And this chap at the microphone there, Lawrence Melchior, an Italian gentleman, tenor, and almost, if not as big a star in the day as Dame Nellie. So these were listened to by hundreds or almost thousands of people. And were very well received. You'd be glad to know we've got about another 10 or 15 minutes, Si, and you can all have a piece. Good luck. However, this chap came along, an MP, Albert Holden Illingworth, Postmaster General, in other words, in charge of all post office matters, including broadcast and telegraphy, telephones, the works, all came with the post office. It was the Postmaster General at that point was a cabinet office position. You know, once you got through Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary, Home Secretary, and the Chancellor, it was one of the more senior positions at this point. And on the 23rd of November 1920, he stood in the House of Commons to inform them that the Marconi broadcasts would be taken off air, mainly pushed by the military and commercial concerns that they might possibly interfere with commercial and military traffic. Because if you remember, the receivers and transmitters at this point were not particularly, the transmitted signals weren't particularly narrow, and the receivers were quite broad. So you couldn't have too many stations too close together without the possibility of interfering with one another. So that MZX was shut down. However, I have to say that the broadcast bug had sort of bitten by then. There was the stations in Europe that continued, from Netherlands and Paris particularly, and others. But radio amateurs, us lot with our call signs, we were a little bit naughty, or at least some of us were. The amateurs continued to broadcast from their home shacks. There's a bit of voice stuff is going on by now. Those who were wealthy enough to afford valves, so they were expensive, they used to break down a lot and just blow, so it was a very expensive game. But they were broadcasting gramophone records and telling the news or whatever else. So there was a little bit of this carrying on. I wonder how many of them had the knock at the door from an employee of the post office. But this is where we leave the Marconi Works at New Street, got my notes, and we move on. We move out of Chelmsford just a few miles up the road, several miles up the road, to a small village. And it was described by the chap that ran the department as a long, low hut in a very muddy field in a village called Writtle in Essex. And this was home to Marconi's aircraft and field communications research department. So we saw those early transmitters that they were building to put in aircraft in World War I. They were still trying to improve their equipment to mount into commercial and military aircraft. And they were doing that at this small hut. Looks like my old scout hut. It's an old military hut, in fact. And interestingly enough, it's now preserved in a museum in Chelmsford. The whole hut is actually inside to recreate what you'll be seeing in these next few slides. And the first few months of working here, the facilities were somewhat basic, scarce. Power came from a generator. There was no main supply. There was no mains water, so they had to get it, delivered. They had a small stove burning coke to warm the place up. And that was all the heating, the heating and for heating water as well. And the toilet, I love this bit, Martin touched on something very similar, a horn from a gramophone. The toilet for the gentlemen, for anything they could stand up for, was the horn of a gramophone poked into the hedge so they could go outside and relieve themselves. I've never actually yet worked out, there was one female employee, how she used to manage, but discretion was the name of the game. But who was in charge of this place? Captain Peter Pendleton Eckersley, PPE as he was known. Born in Mexico, died in Hammersmith, British citizen, British subject as it would have been then. He was also a captain in the Royal Flying Corps, so that's another way he got involved with Marconi and carried on, got used to the wireless equipment and got brought in, had a great mind. And he was head of this division. And beneath, it's not a clear picture, I apologise, I've been looking for a better one. He's seated at the centre of the front row, it's Peter. And at the far right of the picture, as you look at it, there's the only female employee. But the interesting thing to note is that every single person in that photograph there, within 2 years, by 1922, were all employed by the BBC. So they all played their part in the broadcasting. They were real pioneers of the technology for aircraft, and we kept very busy with projects for Marconi. However, they had a bit of a sideline for their evenings. Attitudes with broadcasting were starting to change again in government, and after several requests, Writtle, the team here with Pendleton, were issued by the post office with a experimental broadcast license with the call sign 2, number 2, M for Mike, T for Tango, or in the parlance of the day, 2 Emma Tock. It's quite often the phonetics for M was Emma, 2 Emma Tock, 2 MT. So they got themselves settled in and looking at what could they broadcast, what could they do. But also interesting to note that while they were there, they got very involved with village life, eating and drinking in I think it was the Bell. The Bell was the name of the pub. Playing football against the locals and cricket, making their presence felt. Now, the post office permitted 2MT to broadcast for 30 minutes a week every Tuesday evening. So once a week on a Tuesday evening. And they were supposed to do the following. It was going to be voice transmissions, and they could do what they like. In that sense, it was pretty broad. From 1900 to 1925, so for 25 minutes, they had to broadcast a CW signal to allow listeners in to identify them and to find them on the dial, as it were, with their cat's whiskers or whatever. And that was quite difficult. And from 1925 until 1955, they could broadcast voice. The world was their oyster. However, in that 30 minutes, every 8 minutes, they were supposed to stop for 2 minutes and listen on a receiver. And the idea of that was that in that 2-minute window, if someone from the Ministry of Defence, we call it today, or commercial traffic, could message them and say, look, old man, you're interfering with our commercial concern, and you must stop what you're doing. So that was the theory. And the GPO would do this 30 minutes, won't they? Anyway, you can see the picture of the transmitter with its nice inductance circuit. It used something called an MT4 valve. Don't know much about it, if anything, really. There were 3 of them. One uses a modulator, one for the amplification stage, and one for output. And you've got the rectifier side of it, and it's HT, etc. Looks all very Heath Robinson, but it worked. I've got something on its output power somewhere. I'll get that in a moment. However, we're on about the transmissions. Now, we've gone from the first advertised broadcast to what is now the world's first regular programmed broadcast. Everything else in other countries at this point was still ad hoc. We'll broadcast as and when we feel like. This is the world's, or certainly Britain's, first publicised programme of broadcasting. So the first broadcast was presented by the man himself, Mr. Eckersley. They planned it in the pub. They planned all of their broadcasts in the pub. And if they wanted music, live music, which they quite regularly did, they used to wheel the piano from the pub out the village, down the lane to the hut. So there must have been quite a sight taking beer with them and the piano to go and have an evening of broadcast entertainment. Over the first evening, he sort of introduced things. He had a bit of a way about him. He was a bit of a show-off. Played lots of gramophone records, which were donated by a company to help publicise their records. Made a few jokes and a few comments, and they went off air. It was quite interesting to note that the 2 minutes, every 8 minutes, they were supposed to go off for 2. He never did it. He completely disregarded the instructions. And after their 25 minutes with the CW, he just went and transmitted and did what he liked for 30 minutes. But it was pretty much all Eckersley. Very rarely did anyone else speak. However, telegrams were received from many listeners in, and they were all very positive. In fact, several hundred were received. And things just carried on from there. So every Tuesday. So we can just see the transmitter again. It's the circuit there. Bottom right with the rectifier section, and then at the top there we've got where are we? Sorry. Yes, the modulator, the amplifier, and the output tube, and then to the antenna system, and all very basic. Doesn't look a lot different to some of the things I used. My AM transmitter uses today, to be honest with you. But they got away. They didn't interfere with anybody. They got away with this transmission. And so the aerial system, 4 wires of an inverted L system. We still use, amateurs use inverted Ls. I quite often use one here. Configuration supported by 210-foot masts, wooden masts these were. You think of the wooden masts that were used on the site at Towen, where you actually transmit from. You transmit, if I remember, Martin, is the field where the backup transmitters were. The receiving at masts were at Towen. There were wooden ones by the Marconi bungalows. And then you have the metal masts, the main system, up on the hillside. I'm sure that's about right. So anyway, quite a basic system. They were transmitting on a higher wavelength, 700 meters, and the transmitter, roughly the output at the aerial system was 200 watts. 200 watts, so significantly less power than they had at the previous place in Chelmsford. That's all they were allowed. In fact, the valves in this transmitter were so valuable, they weren't allowed to keep them there. They were actually stock from the stock room to go out to customers at Chelmsford, and each week they had to go down on a motorbike and quietly borrow the valves for the evening, and then take them back and hope they hadn't blown any. Otherwise, they came out of their own wages. Because this was purely, even at this point, Marconi wasn't really convinced of the use of broadcasting. However, the transmissions continued, and was an ever-growing audience for them. And right through until the 17th of January 1923. Eckersley was the main focal point of all of these broadcasts. He was the presenter. One week, the week before, he said next week we're going to have some grand arias, some grand opera to be broadcast. He was the performer. He sang in comic voices and comic tones. He wrote the scripts, if there ever was one, and wrote all the jokes, and all his team just helped support him, keeping him on air with a drink of beer, a cup of tea, sorting out the transmitter or what have you. He was the one responsible for borrowing the piano and transporting it on the hand barrow, like the hand carts the Boy Scouts used to push their equipment to camp. It must have been quite a sight, really. One of the things he used to like doing was taking a gramophone record and putting an off-centre hole in the record. So when you played it on the gramophone, it didn't play properly. It sounded all over the place. You know what they sound like. You slowed the gramophone down and speeded it up, and it was off-centre. They even did some Shakespeare and recreated other plays. This is when Marconi really started to listen to this. And the post office used to issue licenses for people at home to listen in, like they do with the TV license now, and to amateurs, of course. And Marconi was making more and more headsets and some early valve receivers for those who could afford it. So they were selling complete receivers, headphones, cat's whiskers, you name it. They were making quite a lot of money out of it. And all of a sudden, there's a commercial possibility, isn't there? And, you know, Marconi with a few other companies got together. And what did they do? They formed the BBC. And this is where we pretty much end, because mine is the birth of broadcasting, which is Marconi's elements. So the 18th of October, 22, the BBC is formed. Is it the end of Eckersley? No, it's not. He's made by Lord Reith. What's his full name? John Reith, isn't it? Sir John Reith. He became Sir John Reith, the first Director General, or General Manager, then Director General of the BBC. Made Eckersley his chief engineer. And every single one of Eckersley's team was taken on as engineers, including the female one whose name escapes me. In fact, it's always been hard to come by. Were taken on by the BBC. And 2LO, the first BBC transmitter in London, was a Marconi transmitter, broadcast for the first time on November 1922, which you'll note from the end of there. January 23, 2MT finished, so there was a slight crossover when he was still playing with 2MT. But from the moment 2MT closed, that was the end of Eckersley's broadcast career. You know, his wit and humour was well publicised in amateur circles and listeners. The press got hold of it. Except Lord Reith had a different idea about what broadcasting should be. Should it be there to entertain the masses? I would argue not. If you read some of the programming that Lord Reith put on, it was all very highbrow, all more classical music, if there was music, and religious programming and very serious topical programming. So Eckersley was no longer the show-off at the front, but he was working hard behind the scenes. However, that was 22. Within 3 years, Eckersley was sacked, given the boot by Lord Reith, Sir John Reith. His crime, he got divorced, and that was the end of his career. John Reith, being I think it's Presbyterian, he grew up in a very religious family in Scotland, did not believe in divorce, and that was the end of Eckersley's career. And also the end of the birth of broadcasting, because now we've got the BBC, which becomes from a company to a corporation, and in a few short years does an awful lot of work in the country through the Second World War, and amateurs come to the fore again. So we've got a story that starts from leading voice communication in aircraft in a time of war, through to playing around in a shed or a factory, effectively, and the first regular programming to the BBC, and look at the broadcast world we have today. So with that, I would say thank you for listening. I hope I haven't sent anyone to sleep too much. Quite enjoyed coming on. Once I've worked out to stop this.
Right. Well, thank you, Simon. That has been entertaining, really. Really good.
Person.
No. I mean, Has anybody got any questions for Simon?
Nah.
Martin?
Yes. What sort of, do we know the sort of power output of the two MT and two MT and 2 LO?
Yeah. Well, 2MT, so the latter one in the hut, the antenna system was roughly 200 watts output at the antenna system.
Right.
So the input will be about 400 or thereabouts.
I meant output, really.
And this is about 50, just bear with me, I'm trying to remember now. It was, I did mention it, so I'm just trying to remember the exact power outputs.
Simon?
Yes.
There was a good article in Radcom recently regarding Marconi's transmissions, and they actually reckon he was the first QRP station because although he got such a high output transmitter, the inefficiency of the antenna, that meant that you couldn't, by the time the signal got out, he may have been transmitting with a couple of kilowatt, but by the time it got out, he was probably down to about 5 watts. So they reckon one of his stations was the first QRP station. But answer Martin's question.
I will do. Martin, the MZX, so the one in the Hall Street Works, yeah, the input to the antenna system was 16 kilowatt.
Oh, that's more like it.
But bearing in mind that it was horrendously inefficient, you could try and hazard a guess at the output power, but it would still be in kilowatts, but it certainly wouldn't be 8 kilowatt, it would be a darn sight less because of the inefficiency of the antenna system.
Yeah.
Especially when you consider it was 2,800 meter wavelength. I mean, that puts your 472 kilohertz into the shade, really, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Martin's taking photos again. But no, it's just a little bit of the. I started going into the broadcast side because I've been to Towyn. I get told to pronounce it correctly. I've got a Welsh speaker next to me in Gwynedd with TDARS when we've done Marconi Day, which was the receiving site, not broadcast, but that was the commercial CW side of things. And I've also been to Weinbauer, which is the other half of the Towyn site, which is it's much closer to me here. It's sort of about 10 or 12, about 15, 20 minute drive from here. And that's a huge purpose-built, brick-built building, which housed at that point the most powerful rotary spark gap transmitter in the world. And they were linked via telephone lines between the two. The whole transmitter was controlled from Towyn with the receivers, but the transmitter had to be 30 odd miles away because it was, in those days, they were operating transmitting and receiving at the same time, duplex. And if you had them on the same site, the receivers would have received nothing. They were that broadband, it would have just blocked everything out. But anyway, why am I saying that is, that got me interested in Marconi. So then I started to look at the broadcast side of things and start buying books by a chap called Tim Wander. That was the best one. It's called The Birth of British Broadcasting, surprisingly enough, by Tim Wander, which is a very good book to buy, which tells you a lot more detail than I've managed. I don't know the chap. He lives down in the Isle of Wight or somewhere near. He also did one on the Hall Street Works, the New Street Works, and this month being the centenary of that very first broadcast, From Marconi to Melba is his latest tome, which is more of what I call a coffee table book. It's a nice glossy printed book with lots of colorized images of various parts of the story. The story, you could talk about the whole damn thing for several hours. I thought boring you for an hour and 15 was enough. But, it's just great showing that it all started from by accident, really. There was no plan to set up a broadcasting company. It was just a little sideline to test Marconi's Atlantic Leaf. I've read that one, Don. Very good. Anyway, I'm finished. If there's no more questions, it's nice to see you all. Oh, no. David Harris is in a second.
Yeah, well done. Well done.
Thank you.
Thanks for the talk. I've just one question. You won't be able to answer it, but just one question. I wonder how many people in 1916 had receivers for that chap who did the first ever broadcast.
The one in America?
Yeah, I wonder how many people had receivers or some sort of receiving equipment.
Well, to be honest, from what I gathered from the company over there in North America, that the only people that knew he was doing it were employees of the company.
Right.
So one or two that locally that had receivers of some kind that were just experimenting. They were trying to receive company transmissions, and perhaps they had some ship-to-shore communications. So, excuse me. GW0DOG. So there was very few, a handful of people, Simon, would have been the answer.
Yeah.
And I suspect he did make that first, Fessenden did make that first broadcast. And he did say that he did it again on New Year's Eve, so several days later. But I just find it slightly odd that there was nothing written, nothing even reported in their company documents. It only came to light in the 1930s, which is long after Marconi's and, Paris and the Netherlands had started broadcasting. So I'm not quite sure why it took him so long. If I'd created the world's first broadcast, you'd have been shouting it from the rooftops for your company, if nothing else, to try and make your company more commercially viable. He was a commercial concern. Marconi didn't invent wireless. I don't think he invented wireless, but what he did do was put a working system together with help. But he was very good at publicity. He was like Malone, Australian, that Murdoch chap with his media empire now. He might not be particularly good at much, but what he is good at, and Marconi was good at, was gathering support for the idea and selling himself and his company effectively, and having the nice to employ intelligent people. Oh.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah.
I've got the whole Dylan. Dylan's just come from work. Beth's in here as well, and the dogs now, so it's all chaos. But I just want to say thank you for inviting me. I've given this talk 3 times before to a live audience, and you can always feed off people in the live audience a lot easier than you can the little tile screens. So thank you for bearing with me.
Yeah. We're not dead yet, so we are a live audience.
I can tell. Hi, David.
But no, it's been fascinating. That as I say, there's quite a few things that you brought up. As you say, Marconi might not have been the actual father of radio, but he certainly knew how to sell a good thing.
Yeah. Did he describe himself as the world's first radio amateur? That's what he described him.
That goes to something Dennis, doesn't it?
Well, it does in terms of the actual hobby of amateur radio, but he described himself as the world's first because he was one of the first.
I forget what his full name is, but it's Mr. Dennis. He was
Mr. Dennis.
Whatever. I've got it written somewhere, but he was the guy that actually got the first call sign, as was. But anyway, thank you very much.
Good. Greetings from North Wales.
Graham, I'm going to love you and leave you. My daughter's just arrived, so I'm going to go down and see her. So thanks everybody for coming on. Si, thanks for doing the talk, and hi Beth in the corner there.
And to Martin UKV, I've just found your little text message you sent me about. Do we know the output? Apologies, I didn't see that as I was talking.
Yeah, well, you're not surprising. Hello to
Beth, yeah.
Beth, yeah, sorry. Hi, Beth.
With that, ladies and gentlemen, there's John. Many happy returns, John.
Oh, happy birthday!
Thank you very much.
Another turn on the wheel, John.
Yeah. I'll catch you up soon, Beth.
Never.
Who's Merv, by the way? I see he hadn't put a camera on, but who's Merv? Do we know?
Merv is his course on his Golf Whiskey 1 Sierra Golf, Silly Girl Guide.
Oh, right.
He's a member of the Dragon Club.
Oh, right. Hi, Merv.
Yeah, I'm surprised you didn't put a picture up, but there you are. It's,
Are you going to give us a camera?
Yeah. Okay, he was going.
Camera there.
Oh, he normally does, yeah. Maybe he's doing other things and he's just listening in.
Yeah. Well, he's got his mic muted, I noticed.
Yeah, please. Anyway, I should you all a good evening. See, if it was a normal club night now I'd come to, we'd be off down to the Huntsman, wouldn't we?
Yeah.
But as I'm at home, I'll make do with another cup of tea. So cheers all. Put that down. I hope to see you all out soon.
Cheers, Simon.
Good night.
Thank you very much.
Not sweat that. There you are. Cheers. all.
Diolch yn fawr.
Take care, guys.
All the best. Is that right, Beth? Diolch yn fawr. Something like that.
That's the Welsh done. I'm off. See you all. Ta-da.
Bye.
Again, Simon.